talk about some very uncomfortable reports coming out about Nigeria's election. Well, a leading Nigerian civil society organization, Yaga Africa, has reviewed the outcome of the 2023 general election. Yeah, it's over a year now that we've known the outcome of the election, but what are the lessons for future polls in this country? At a roundtable yesterday in Abuja, the group presented a document which is titled the Electoral Trust, Nigeria's electoral process 1 year after the 2023 general election. It highlights the failures and the lessons of the process. I'm being joined by the promoter of the report and the executive director of Yaga Africa, Mr. Samson Itodo. He's a lawyer and a rights activist. Thanks so much indeed for your time tonight.
Always a delight. Good evening, Nigerians.
Wow. 1 year after, it looks like yesterday,
yes.
Where a lot of things failed, a lot of disappointments, some movement in the positive direction.
And some surprises.
Some surprises. I mean, for some of us who are watching and analyzing things, we do know that it is not all negatives for that election, but a lot of lessons. But in your report, a year after, what do you think was so significant that you found out?
Well, there are about 7 trends that we found. The first one is that the trust in the electoral process is declining, and that the off-cycle elections, the Kogi, Bayelsa, and Imo elections, and the by-elections were a missed opportunity to rebuild public trust in the electoral process. Because in those elections, we saw cases like pre-filled result sheets. We saw padding of turnout figures. We also saw violence and hijack of election materials and also attacks on personnel. And so politicians went on rampage and made it difficult, for the Electoral Commission to conduct elections. The second major trend was that after 1 year, from the general elections, the president is yet to articulate, an electoral reform agenda. And that is concerning because it is uncertain, and his stance on electoral reform, is unknown. And we've called, on the president to articulate an electoral reform agenda that complements what the National Assembly is doing, because the National Assembly have been providing leadership, on reforms. But it isn't just, electoral reforms isn't just a business of the National Assembly. The executive does have a role, because when the National Assembly concludes its work, it does require presidential assent. So we hope that the president will, articulate an agenda. There's also the issue of obstruction of justice. And we've seen cases where litigants, petitioners, or even respondents have encountered challenges in accessing election materials that the law provides that they have a right to those materials. So how do you litigate? How do you ventilate, an electoral dispute or prove your case if you don't have access to the materials? Look at what happened in Kogi, where thugs, barricaded INEC offices, made it difficult, for lawyers representing candidates and political parties in the elections, to access those materials. These are some of, the trends, issues around turnout. Turnout has been abysmally low, and it should be concerning, to Nigerians that on a consistent basis, turnout is so poor. The lowest in the by-election was 8.2%.
Samson, let's give some perspectives, and I'd like my producer to follow us in this space that we're going to go through, because there are some facts that we need to talk through, and page by page we will be able to go through. And like Samson also to speak to these as quickly as we can. I want us to touch so that Nigerians can be able to get perspectives on the essence of an electoral reform in this country. If you're talking about justice sector reforms, we also need to be talking about electoral reforms, because that's the only way we can guarantee a sustained change of government and elections, of course. So first and foremost, let's look at a quick fact on this election. The 2023 election, as identified, 7th in the consecutive general elections, 7th in the round of election that we have seen since 1999. There was a new electoral law which now regulates the election, which was passed before the election, which is the 2022 Electoral Act. It was one of the most meticulously planned elections since 1999. There was a budget of 355.2 billion. 313 billion was released. There's an outstanding of 41 billion. Something.
Yeah, in fact, just to focus on the last part, and when it comes to the elections budget, we can clearly see that INEC is yet to receive all the funding that it requires for the elections. But one of the concerns that Nigerians have also expressed is the cost of elections. And so when you see that about 313 billion was released, ask yourself, how many percentage of that money was used to print over 500 million sheets of paper, which was used as ballot papers and result sheets? And you have a case where only 27% of people turned up for the elections. So we have millions, hundreds of millions that have gone to waste just because people didn't show up, at the last election. Or some people showed up, but due to voter suppression, they were prevented to cast their vote. So there's a lot of waste. But if you look at the fact that the election was the most meticulously planned election since 1999, there was advance, notice that was provided for planning. You had a new electoral law. So if you, in terms of planning, this election,
you would think that this should be the best election. Interesting, that is the 7th consecutive general elections. The first one since 1999 saw an Olusegun Obasanjo become president from the Southwest. It's a coincidence also that you have, and the 7th election, you have a Bola Tinubu from the Southwest become governor. Well, this figure sometimes people say are significant.
It's just geopolitics.
All right, interesting. So I mean, I'm just pointing it out. So let's flip the page and look at the off-cycle election. So we had Kogi, Imo, and Bayelsa State. They followed just a few months after the general elections. But did we see any significance of, did it rub off the general election? Did it rub off on all these 3 off-cycle elections?
I think in the aspect of turnout, it did run off. Also about the trust levels in the elections. And by the time we came to November last year, and people already checked out, people didn't have trust in the electoral process. And so that also impacted on the level of turnout, but also how people engage. But on the part of, politicians, we saw, new tactics employed, by politicians to undermine the credibility of the process, especially in places like Kogi, where you saw pre-filled result sheets. How can you have an election before voting, accreditation and voting commenced? Result sheets were already completed and votes allocated to candidates. And you also saw what actually happened, and this was widespread, in Kogi Central Senatorial District. But you also look at what happened in Bayelsa, where INEC officials were abducted, where there was hijack of materials, and in some cases, thugs made it so difficult, for INEC to conduct elections. But if you go to the by-elections, if we pivot into that, if you
look, we had 9 states in those elections, 2 senatorial districts, 4 federal constituency, and 3 state constituencies. These were the by-elections.
These were the by-elections in February.
Elections.
Yes, from the for by-elections you had in 9 of them in 9 states, and then for a run you had 35 in 35 constituencies. Wow. One recurring decimal, in this election was unchecked electoral misconduct. You could see what happened in Kunchi local government of Kano, where a political party mobilized hundreds of thugs to the polling unit, hijacked the materials and the INEC officials, and they were now conducting the election themselves. So you had elections conducted by thugs. But you saw INEC responded by canceling, and suspending election in places like Plateau, in Enugu, in Ebonyi, actually Ebonyi, in Enugu, in Akwa Ibom, and in Kano, due to these levels of brigandage and political thuggery. And this is coming against the background that since the 2023 elections, the number of convictions that have been secured for individuals that undermine the process, individuals who appropriated violence to compromise the elections, have been very, very, very small. And that is disturbing.
Not only the by-election, they are rerun election, but we need to let our viewers know also that it's not for joke that by-elections and rerun elections are conducted. It's because when the general elections or the ordinary elections are not properly conducted, or there are problems in the election, that is when this happens.
Rerun, because
so
for
you have the magnitude of all of these elections happening.
They are court-ordered elections, but for by-elections, it was a result of resignation or death of people who previously won the elections in February and March last year.
So you look at the outcome of those rerun elections, and you see the yellow all over the map, which shows the rerun elections, you know. And of course, one thing that comes to mind is the wastage that we see.
Yeah.
If you know that you have some ambitions, why put yourself out for an election when you know you want to be a minister or you want to be something else? And then you allow the nation to spend, because people need to realize that it's the hard-earned taxpayers' money that is being spent to conduct these elections. But let's look at the outcome of the by-election, something. And we see the Senate, House of Reps, State Assembly. And what does this picture tell us?
Yeah, so one of the consistent trend, you know, so in this field of elections and also public policy, if something happens once, we consider it an accident. If it happens twice, we consider it a trend. If it happens 3 times, then it's substantive proof of a particular social phenomenon. And in this particular case, what we saw in the general elections, where we had the most diverse legislature, so about 7 to 8 parties won seats in the National Assembly, is what was replicated also in the by-elections. So you can clearly see that you had, I think 6 or 7 political parties. Seven political parties.
Predominantly.
Yeah, at least won some seats in the state houses of assembly elections. So that trend is actually consistent with what we saw, in the general elections.
All right, if you look at the voter turnout, this is one thing that is concerning and worrying also. And you see in the staggered elections, in Kogi, 40%, in Imo, 29%, Bayelsa, 28%, in Lagos, 8.2%, which is the lowest turnout. This was the election which saw the replacement of Fenba Jabiamila, who became the chief of staff. And you see the highest turnout in that off-cycle at 33%. So what does this tell us about the enthusiasm of voters?
I think that there are 3 things here. First, there is need, for democracy to deliver. If you're going to repose public trust, and confidence in the electoral process, that when people are elected, they should take decisions that solve the problems that people actually voted them into office to solve. Secondly, it's about trust in the electoral process. And that's why, this report released by Yaga Africa, we asked the question, has electoral trust been restored? If people don't trust that their votes will count, there's no way they are going to show up at elections. If people don't trust that those who are managing that election will do so with the highest sense of integrity and responsibility, they're not going to show up at elections. These are the fundamental issues, because trust is at the heart of driving turnout for elections.
So let's quickly, I like also touch on what is an also worrying scenario, because I'm not sure we've seen this kind of scenario played out since 2011, where we saw a lot of election disputes going into the courts. We saw 3,102 election disputes, 1,893 pre-election matters on party primaries and non-qualification and intra-party conflict, which also tells us that political party administration in this country is poor. And we saw 1,209 election petitions, 5 presidential, 83 governorship, 143 senatorial, 417 House of Reps, and 557 state constituencies. When you see a lot of dispute, it tells you something about the conduct of the election.
Yeah, not just the conduct of the election, but it also tells you about the character of the political parties and political class. And I think it's important that this point about the fate and the health of our political parties and our political culture is one that requires a national conversation. That you cannot have political parties that do not respect their own constitution and their rules. Just look at the amount of pre-election disputes in the elections, where you see it was as a result of what? Unlawful substitution of candidates, defective party primaries, or even intra-party rivalry.
Failure of the political parties. And in fact, I warned here, you remember something, yes. I was warning, I said, this 2022 Electoral Act, these political parties need to sit down with lawyers to understand, but they did not. And I pointed out some of those sections, and these are sections that were debated in the courtroom. I look like a prophet. I hate to be one, but now it has happened that these political parties are falling, they fell into the trap because they fail to understand the intricacies and the trap and the gaps in the electoral laws.
Absolutely. And when it's important that, we recognize that one of the biggest threats, to the credibility of our electoral process is really our political parties and our politicians. That there is need for political parties to not just undertake reforms, but uphold the cardinal principles of democracy. You cannot seek political power or seek power through a democratic process when you don't have regard, for the tenets of democracy.
Unfortunately, Samson, we don't have political parties when there are no elections. They all go to sleep and they are very idle. People have forgotten there are very four legs to our democracy. A ruling government, an opposition party, a functional civil society, and an unbiased and independent media. People forget that the running of all of these entities are very crucial.
But you forgot the judiciary as well.
The judiciary, well, it's part of government, absolutely. But look, Samson, let's run through these 2 or 3 slides, which are very important because these are the lessons. We have the education of the election dispute and the summary of the fact that we have petitions that are withdrawn, petitions rejected, and the ones that lack merit, and 102 petitions were successful. And you are calling for 2 things. These are particularly very important legislative actions on the electoral reforms. You're asking for electoral reform bills, citizen town halls and retreats, Joint National Assembly Committee on Electoral Reform, Joint National Assembly Technical Committee on Electoral Reform. And you also are talking about prosecution of electoral offenses, and largely you are asking the president to do something, the post-2023 general election trends. What are your final words on some of these issues?
I think the president has a critical role. He celebrates 1 year in office. And I think as part of what he should prioritize, is to tell the nation his stance on electoral reforms and the agenda that he has, because it will inspire public trust and confidence. That advancing and articulating an electoral reform agenda does not in any way delegitimize the process that brought you into office. Instead, it actually inspires confidence, and it shows that as a president, you have the interest of our electoral democracy at heart, because there are some challenges. And the National Assembly and the 2 committees in the National Assembly, you must give it to them in the citizens' approach that they've adopted in passing the legal framework. But I think to the judiciary, that our courts and our judiciary need to undertake an internal audit of the role that the judiciary played, and interrogate this whole conflicting judgments that we saw in the course of this entire process.
So the judiciary has its role, the executive has its role, and the National Assembly also has its role, and we need to fix it. And that engagement has to happen now, because if you are going to repair, fix, and reform the electoral law, we need to do it way ahead. And it has to start
because we don't have time.
Thank you for your job at Yaga Africa, because it's opened everybody's eyes on what we need to do to achieving a better election. Thank you so much indeed. Congratulations to you and your team at Yaga Africa.
Thank you very much.